My name is Catherine Henney and I'm a legal director specialising in inquests, inquiries and health and safety. Today's episode is titled The House of Lords Statutory Inquiries Committee. What now for the future of public inquiries? And I'm joined by Sarah Jones, head of the Public Inquiries team at Evershed Sutherland, and Isabel Mitchell, a partner who also leads that team. This episode was recorded back in March when I sat down with Sarah and Izzy to discuss the recent response of the government the previous month to the House of Lords Statutory Inquiries Committee report, which was issued to the government in September 2024. Given the breadth of that report and the subsequent response, this episode has been recorded in two parts. Today's discussion focuses on the three key areas considered by the committee and how the government has responded with a view to enhancing public trust and confidence in public inquiries. We talk about the implementation of inquiry recommendations, the perennial issues of delay and cost, and the options for improving best practice. We hope you enjoy. In February 2024, the House of Lords established a special statutory inquiries committee to invite the public to give its views on the law and practice of how inquiries work under the Inquiries Act 2005, with a view to enhancing public trust in the system. It issued its report to the government in September 2024, which identified three key areas to address and made a number of findings and recommendations. The government published its response in February this year, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, so of course the House of Lords Committee also revisited the Inquiries Act 10 years ago, back in 2013, and many of the issues that were discussed then were discussed 10 years later and are common issues that come up in this practice area. So it's good to be getting together, talking about these sorts of issues that feature in our working lives. Also, full disclosure that as a firm, we provided two written submissions to both of those committees, so back in 2013 and last year, as part of the evidence gathering process. But it is inevitably, as public inquiries practitioners, areas that interest us.
Thanks. So just looking at the three areas of focus for the committee, these were, just taking them broadly, the first one, implementation of recommendations, minimising delay and reducing cost, and good practice in public inquiries. So I'm keen that we take each of those in turn and discuss your thoughts. So moving to the first one, which is implementation of recommendations, and perhaps that's one that's received quite a lot of press recently, where there seems to be increasing criticism of public inquiries, that there is no system of ensuring accountability and oversight for the implementation of recommendations that are made by public inquiries. What's your thought on that, just as a general point, Sarah?
Well, I think an issue that's been debated for years is whether public inquiries, through their recommendations, result in change. And of course, it's the main aim of any public inquiry to try to ensure that events don't reoccur. I remember when we started the mid-staffs inquiry, which was back in 2010, that our initial thoughts were looking back at the Bristol Royal Infirmary recommendations, which had been made in, I think, 1998, that if all of those recommendations had been adopted, we may not have found ourselves in the situation where the mid-staffs inquiry was needed at all. And I'm sure that there will be many other examples of that. So one of current relevance is Sarah Sharif, and I suspect that if we looked back at the recommendations that came out of the Columbia inquiry, we'd probably reach a very similar conclusion.
I suppose, just interjecting at that point, that it brings into play another issue, which is what makes an inquiry effective. Is it the implementation of recommendations? Or are there other aspects such as the catharsis to victims, families, finding out what happened and getting answers? So implementation of recommendations is, of course, important, but it's possibly not the only measurement when you're looking at effectiveness. But that's probably a topic for another podcast. I think one of our previous guests...
Yes, I had with Boston Welch.
Yes, has covered that anyway. So, but just a point to raise. Sorry to interject, Sarah.
That's all right. I mean, coming back to the implementation of recommendations, I think that one of the challenges chairs face is who's going to monitor implementation once they're no longer in post, because of course under the Inquiries Act the way it operates is that once the terms of reference have been fulfilled, the chair's post is no more. So there's nobody in post to hold those who should be implementing the recommendations to account. And I think we've seen some chairs be quite creative about that. Some of them have been very vocal post a period of time when implementation recommendations haven't been implemented. But of course, any work they do around that, they're doing in their own time. But we've definitely seen some very committed chairs who've continued to comment on the progress of recommendations when they're no longer in post.
And I suppose we've seen this very recently with ICSA and the whole furore over the New Year period with Elon Musk sort of wading in about the grooming gang scandal, and there being calls for a national public inquiry into grooming gangs, and the counter-argument being that ICSA had a module on grooming gangs, had reported, I think it might have been 2 years, as recent as 2 years ago, and none of the recommendations had been implemented. And that was the argument against commissioning another national public inquiry if recommendations from one hadn't yet been acted upon. And I suppose at that point, possibly worth touching on the model that we as a firm are quite familiar with, which came up in that context, which was the independent inquiry in Telford relating to grooming gangs, which was a non-statutory council-commissioned inquiry, but had been commented on in that context as being a model that ensured effective implementation. I think the vast majority of those recommendations have been implemented 2 years later. And the way that model worked, and again, full disclosure, we were solicitors to that inquiry, so we may be speaking about it in very
might be a bit biased,
positive terms, but in the terms of reference, there was quite deliberately written in a 2-year review period to provide for that process of implementation that otherwise doesn't exist, because once an inquiry's work is finished, it's effectively defunct, and the flexibility of the non-statutory model means that that's possibly easier to achieve. But it meant that the pressure remained on not just positive findings at the end of an inquiry report, but actually the next stage, which some would say is the more important stage, which is implementation, and whether that is something that might be seen going forwards more about this sort of review period. Other inquiry chairs have been less successful in negotiating that, certainly retrospectively anyway, but whether that is something that might change in the future. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we touched upon it just there, that obviously the previous podcast that I did with Austin Welch was on, how you measure the success of an inquiry, and a lot of that was about, accountability and the public seeking accountability through the inquiry, but actually how else you might achieve that through implementation of recommendations. And obviously we were both involved in Telford. I wasn't as involved as you early days in terms of setting up the terms of reference and commissioning that inquiry. I'm just interested how that 2-year review period came about. Was that a suggestion of victims and survivors, because I know there was some engagement with them, or was it a suggestion of the council or from us in terms of the drafting of those?
I would say it's come from experience of those. As I said at the top of this, these are issues that we have debated as practitioners for years in terms of how do you make sure that the inquiry that you're delivering is effective and achieves what it's supposed to achieve. So it was a deliberate drafting into the terms of reference by those who were responsible for delivering that inquiry.
Okay. And I think as public inquiry practitioners, I mean, we've all done this for many, many years now. I think we would all hand on heart say we genuinely care when we finish an inquiry. It is important to us as practitioners that all of the hard work that's gone into that inquiry results in lasting change. That is why we do it after all. And so I think that we would all be keen to find solutions, whatever they may be, to ensure that happens in the future. I think it probably saddens all of us when we hear public inquiries being criticised, because terms of reference are not fully implemented. That's not what any of us would want to see.
Yeah, and I think if we look back to, and again, you and I, all three of us worked on mid-staffs, and if we look at back then, Sir Robert Francis around the duty of candour, and still now you hear a lot being said about that and about trying to continually progress with the duty of candour. So I absolutely second that we want to see real change, and that also the public wants to see meaningful change, of course, but so do we as practitioners. We don't do it for anything other than to try to satisfy those terms of reference. So just a bit of a probing question perhaps. The government's suggestion in its response is that there should be a new public inquiries committee, and that also there should be lessons learnt reports at the end of any public inquiry, but also some working reports released along the way, I guess to show that there's continual sort of review for effectiveness and implementation where necessary. Can I ask what your views are on those proposals?
I think it's a sensible proposal. Gives that role to someone to hold government departments, organisations that are responsible for implementing recommendations to account. I think that the committee had recommended that it be a parliamentary committee, and from memory the government response has said that is a recommendation for Parliament, and that it's committed for wider reform around inquiries. So it does remain unclear what that might actually look like. I think if it's not a parliamentary committee, how it's staffed and funded would obviously be critical to ensure that it's got the weight behind it to ask difficult questions of ministers and others, and the ability to kind of publish responses and that be given the weight that it should be, to ensure it's an effective body. Otherwise, I think there's a risk it could just become a mailbox for people to say, well, we've done this and we've done that, to implement recommendations, but without sort of sufficient pressure behind it to affect change.
Yeah. And in terms of reports and interim reports, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's another tool that we've seen chairs use. I think the suggestion of interim reports is always easier to say rather than do, because a significant amount of work goes into the production of any report, and the more interim reports you have, the more time you're going through redaction processes, for instance. But I don't think there's any doubt that they can be quite effective for a number of reasons. One is it means that recommendations are made more swiftly, which can only be a good thing. Going back to what I said previously, the main focus of the inquiry is to prevent similar circumstances happening again. So the quicker recommendations can be made and implemented that can stop that, the better. I think the other advantage is, of course, the chair continues in post then, because the chair has still got to fulfil his or her terms of reference, and so they're able to keep a watchful eye on the implementations of the recommendations that they've made in any interim report. So I think it's something to be very mindful of. It won't suit every inquiry, but it's definitely another tool.
Well, it's been used in Grenfell, hasn't it, in terms of interim reports, and of course
and ICSA and COVID. And I think there can be often, a pressure for a chair to produce interim reports to be seen to be getting urgent recommendations out there. And I mean, on Grenfell, for safety reasons, that was certainly the need for that sort of first interim report. Anything urgent that was going to impact public safety should be, any recommendation should be made as quickly as possible. So there's always that pressure. But I think what Sarah says is right, is that interim reports won't always suit all inquiries, and it does incur additional time. And I mean, we may come on to this about sort of duration and cost of inquiries, but every report requires maxwellising, it requires, careful drafting, evidence analysis, redaction. I mean, the list is long, so there's a cost attached to interim reports that But so they can be useful, but it's always a sort of a balancing act.
And it is an absolute balancing act, isn't it? And we're moving into the second area, I think, here of minimising delay and reducing costs. We'll come into that in a second. But just reflecting back on Grenfell and the public safety point, I mean, it was sitting in the shadows of not having responded to the Lacanau House fire. And so in a way, if it hadn't, and that was going to be a very long running inquiry, and so if there wasn't, I can imagine the public clamour for some kind of interim reports is much higher. And perhaps when you know that an inquiry is going to last, 3, 4, 5 years, that's more of a reason why you should be upfront about considering interim reports. One of the things that comes out of this, the committee report, and is within this second area of focus of minimising delay and reducing cost. Again, one of the high-level things that jumped out to me was the recommendation that within terms of reference, there should be an initial indicative deadline set for the conclusion of the inquiry. Can I get your thoughts on whether that's something that you would be supportive of, or you think would be realistic to include an indicative timeline?
Gosh, I mean, I've sat with a number of chairs now who have been keen right at the outset to set that deadline for, I think with a genuine desire for it to be for everybody's benefit. I think the problem is that until an inquiry really gets going and you start to collect some evidence, it's really difficult to know. Because of course it's an inquisitorial process, and if you do a truly inquisitorial process, I find it hard to understand how at such an early stage you could possibly know where that process might take you. So I'm not saying they should be open-ended and there should be no plan. I think it's absolutely important that there is a plan. But to set that right at the outset, I think would be tricky and potentially quite dangerous. I think there would be a view by some that you might be seeking to curtail the work of an inquiry, which would not go down very well, certainly with victims and survivors.
I think helpfully the committee's report and I think the government's response acknowledged that it's quite hard at the outset of an inquiry when you don't know how many documents, you don't know how many witnesses, you don't know how many weeks hearings you're going to have, all of those big questions which without that information is really difficult to set a realistic, even if still with factors unknown, time scale. They did acknowledge that, so which is helpful. I think what they said is having a time scale allows some pressure so that things keep moving and that it's not sort of dawdling along. I think the counter argument to that would be how helpful is it for a chair to go into print with a date that they then have to revise a number of times, and what does that do for public confidence? So the point at which you go into print probably has to be thought about quite carefully.
And I was just going to say though that I think that project management is of crucial importance in a public inquiry, because I think it's hard to think about it in terms of it being a project, but it is, because all public inquiries have a start, a middle and an end. And it's just really important that there's a proper project management team, I think, involved, so that the work is, set out in phases, that there's appropriate resource, and you're constantly thinking about timeframes as part of that project planning process. So I think that that's something that's kind of really important. That historically probably didn't happen in the way that it does now, just because I think things have developed in the world of kind of legal project management, really.
Yeah, I think also it's about engaging with the public and about your methods of communication and sort of bringing them along in understanding that process, because so much goes on behind closed doors that is legitimate reasons for things taking the length of time that they do. But if the public don't understand, they can rightly just think that there is just justice is being delayed, it's not being served, it's being drawn out. And also on the other side of it, you get claims for, the amount of public funds that are being put towards this, that is just going on and on and on with no end in sight. So I think there is a long part of that project management needs to be a sort of a communication strategy and understanding exactly what, if there is delay, why actually in order to fulfil the terms of reference you have to have a proper inquiry into a particular, term of reference that might have thrown up a million pages of material. When we've all been there, haven't we? When you suddenly land a whole load of material that then has to be reviewed that you haven't anticipated. So I think that's probably part of project management as well, is making sure bringing the public along. Make sure you tune in for part 2 of this episode by subscribing to Through the Inquisitor's Lens podcast.